No one would have blamed him if he walked away. A wolf half drowned beneath a frozen river in Jackson Hole, eyes glazed with frost, body trembling in silence. But Gideon Wells, a man with nothing left to lose, stepped forward. Not because he believed he could save it, but because he knew what it felt like to sink quietly and be forgotten. That morning, he pulled a dying soul from the ice and unknowingly gave his own heart a reason to beat again. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. In the heart of a Jackson Hole winter, the world didn't just freeze, it hushed. The tall pines wore heavy coats of snow, bending like old sentinels. The Snake River, winding silently through the Grand Teton foothills, had long surrendered to ice. Under that thick crust, nothing moved except that morning. Something did. Gideon Wells hadn't intended to find anything. A man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair that curled under his knit cap, and eyes the color of dark cedar, Gideon had stopped seeking long ago. Once a celebrated wildlife photographer, he now lived alone in a cabin just beyond the ranger trail. A man faded into the forest. His gait was slow boots, cracking against frost shotgun slung over one shoulder, not for sport, but protection. His beard, trimmed but untamed, caught snowflakes as he crossed the ridge above the riverbank. He had gone out before sunrise, hoping only to photograph the first light hitting the mountains, but the cold air pulled him farther. Something strange in the quiet tugged at him. And then he saw it. At the river's edge, where the ice had splintered from beneath, something pale moved barely. He squinted, stepped down the bank, boots slipping on the frozen brush. A shape, low trembling, barely above the surface. As he approached, the scene took hold of his breath. A wolf. Its fur was nearly white, tangled and dripping. Two front legs clawed at the brittle ice shelf body submerged in black water beneath. Its eyes, once wild and sharp, were dulled, hugged with frost. There was no sound, no whimpering, just the desperate tremble of limbs refusing to give up. Gideon could have walked away. He was not a man known for sentiment anymore. After losing his wife and daughter in an avalanche near Denali years ago, he'd built a quiet world where things didn't break your heart because they didn't get close. But this animal, broken and silent, reminded him of something he couldn't name. He cursed under his breath, then knelt. Carefully, he laid down his coat on the ice to avoid slipping, reached forward, and took hold of the wolf's scruff. It didn't resist. Its body was ice cold and heavier than expected, easily 180 pounds. Gideon's muscles burned as he pulled inch by inch, groaning through gritted teeth, until the wolf lay on solid ground. Unmoving, he stared at the creature. Its ribs showed through its matted coat. There was a wound on its back leg, possibly from struggling against jagged ice. The breath came shallow, each exhale forming a ghost against the wind. "You stupid thing," Gideon muttered, wrapping the animal in his flannel overshirt. "You're not supposed to be here." He carried it the mile back to his cabin, slow and brutal. The snow had deepened overnight, and each step took twice the effort. More than once, Gideon paused, adjusting the wolf's weight across his shoulder, muttering half prayers, half curses into the wind. By the time he reached the cabin, his knees were shaking his back, screaming. Inside, he stoked the wood stove to life, steam rising off the cast iron kettle. He laid the wolf near the fire, gently removing the soaked shirt and covering it with 2 wool blankets. The animal didn't move, didn't growl, just breathed. For hours, Gideon sat by the fire watching. He brewed coffee but didn't drink it. Instead, he rubbed the wolf's paws to restore circulation, whispering unintelligible phrases, more to himself than the beast. Night fell early. The temperature dropped hard. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside the fire glowed warm and soft. At one point, the wolf stirred, letting out a low breath, eyes fluttering open. Gideon leaned in, "You're still here," he said quietly. The wolf blinked once. Its eyes, though foggy, locked onto his. Not wild, not afraid. Just waiting. He named it Frost, a name not born of poetry, but of instinct. Frost because that's what had nearly claimed it. And perhaps in some metaphor, Gideon refused to admit because that's what had claimed him long ago. The next morning the wolf had not moved. Gideon boiled oats and venison broth. Frost didn't eat but took in a few spoonfuls of liquid. He cleaned the wound with warm water and clove oil, then wrapped the leg with old linen he found in his daughter's untouched chest. His hands shook more from memory than cold. 3 days passed. Frost did not stand, but remained near the fire silent, and still his chest rising gently. Gideon read aloud sometimes weather updates, old newspapers, even a field journal he once kept. His voice cracked with disuse. But the cabin for once felt full, not of joy, but of presence. On the 4th morning, Gideon woke to find Frost staring at him, not passively but present. The wolf still did not move its hind legs, but its ears twitched at sounds, its breath steady. Gideon reached out slowly, laying a calloused hand on its fur. "You and me," he whispered. "We both got caught in something cold, huh?" The snow kept falling outside, thick, soft flakes drifting past the window. The river remained locked in silence, and in a cabin built by a man who had forgotten how to feel. A wild soul breathed beside the hearth. The nights in Jackson Hole grew longer after the new moon, when the sky turned to ink and the snow kept falling without pause. The wind was quieter now, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Inside the cabin, the air glowed gold from the stove's belly, casting flickers across the wooden walls, where pictures of forgotten trips still hung their corners curled by time. Frost remained curled by the hearth, unmoving, except for the shallow rise and fall of his ribcage. His hind legs refused to answer him. At times, they trembled, as if haunted by the memory of movement. Gideon Wells adjusted the thick wool blanket over the wolf's body and slid a pan of water near the fire to warm. The wolf had begun drinking more steadily, even licking the broth spoon now and then. But food still seemed foreign to him. Gideon rose slowly from his worn leather chair, his knees creaking in protest, and fetched a bundle of dried herbs from a cabinet near the door. The leaves crumbled between his fingers, releasing the scent of juniper and bitterroot. These weren't ordinary herbs. They were wrapped in a strip of doe skin and marked with ink symbols from the Shoshone people, a gift from an elder named Ira Ghostcloud, a quiet man Gideon had once photographed for a tribal medicine documentary a decade ago. Ira had said little back then, but he'd left Gideon with a satchel of gathered plants and a warning. "Someday, you won't need a camera to see." Gideon hadn't understood at the time. He did now. He ground the herbs with hot water, creating a poultice that he applied gently to Frost's joints and lower back. His hands worked slowly, purposefully, not just for healing, but for comfort. The wolf didn't growl, didn't flinch. He simply looked at Gideon with those quiet gold eyes, wild, but still. Days passed with the rhythm of tending warm water, feeding herbal compresses, quiet murmurs. In between, Gideon wrote. It started on a whim. A torn, leather-bound notebook long buried in a drawer beneath winter socks found its way back to the table. The pen felt awkward in his hand, but his words came like thawed rivers. He didn't write about the wolf at first. He wrote about Montana, about Grandfather Ellis, who wore elk-hide gloves even in summer, who could track a rabbit across shale with his eyes closed. A man of few words, but when he spoke, the forest listened. Gideon remembered long hikes through Glacier National Park, his grandfather teaching him how to tell how old a bear print was by the way snow slumped inside it. He wrote about his daughter Annika and her wild curiosity, how she once spent a whole afternoon building a mouse hotel from pine cones, how she had screamed with joy when they saw wolves howling on a ridge during a family camping trip. Her voice had rung through the air like music. He stopped writing after that. Closed the book, stared into the fire. Frost shifted. It was the first time the wolf had moved with intent. His forepaws dug gently into the rug. Gideon blinked. "You're listening," he whispered. The silence was broken only by the occasional crackle of wood. But there was something else. A presence. A bond slowly forming not out of dominance or fear, but of something quieter. A recognition. Like two mirrors held up to each other and finding warmth in the reflection. Outside, the storm raged again. Branches scratched the roof, and the sky screamed with sleet. But inside, Gideon had found a rhythm again. He cleaned the old camera on the mantel, ran his fingers along the shutter. He didn't raise it to his eye, not yet, but he didn't shove it back into hiding either. One night, perhaps the coldest yet, a different sound stirred the cabin. A low growl, not from Frost, but from deep within the earth, it seemed. Frost's ears perked, and his head lifted fully for the first time. He stared at the door. Gideon stood, grabbed the lantern, and opened it slowly. Nothing but wind and snow. But Gideon didn't close the door right away. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the dark ridge beyond the clearing. Then he saw them, two tiny prints, half filled with snow. Not animal. Boots. Small ones. The next morning he found the source. A child's jacket, red torn, caught on a branch near the edge of his trail. Inside the lining was a library card with a name, Caleb Monroe. No address. No adult in sight. Gideon felt something heavy in his chest. Was the boy lost, abandoned, or something worse? He returned to the cabin and looked at Frost. "Might be more than just you in need of saving," he said aloud. The wolf blinked. That evening, Gideon packed supplies. Extra blankets, matches, jerky. He laid them by the door. Frost watched him the whole time, eyes tracking his every move like he understood. He bent down, ran a hand through the thick fur behind Frost's ear, and whispered, "Long night ahead." The wind howled. The mountains stood frozen. And for the first time in years, Gideon felt not alone in the dark, but guided by it. The morning Caleb Monroe arrived at the cabin, the sky over Jackson Hole was the color of old paper. Flat gray and windless. The snow had paused, but the world was still hushed, in a silence that came after storms. Gideon stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching as the Forest Service truck rumbled up the ridge road. The driver was a young woman in a ranger's uniform, Sarah Bell dark hair pulled into a braid, calm but watchful eyes. She stepped out and opened the passenger door. Caleb hesitated before climbing out. He was 13, but looked younger, slim and pale, with unkempt brown hair and a coat too big for his frame. A bruise faded under his left eye, and he clutched a sketch pad like it was armor. His sneakers were soaked within minutes of stepping into the snow. He didn't speak right away. "Gideon Wells," Sarah called. "That's me. This is your grandson. His mother said it was urgent." Her tone was neutral, but her eyes flicked toward the boy with a shadow of concern. Gideon nodded. "You can leave him here." Sarah hesitated. "There's a number inside the bag, if anything feels off call." Gideon grunted, took the boy's duffel. Caleb didn't meet his eyes as he followed the older man into the cabin. Inside, the fire was already lit. The warmth hit Caleb immediately, along with the thick scent of cedar-old coffee and animal fur. He froze in place when he saw the wolf. Frost lay on a braided rug beside the hearth head raised slightly. The boy stepped back. "That's a wolf," Caleb whispered, alarm rising in his voice. "He's recovering. Half wild, maybe." "But he's not a threat," Gideon said, taking off his coat. "Long as you don't give him a reason." Caleb's fingers tightened on his sketch pad. His voice came out soft. "Does he have a name?" Frost. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound. Over the next hours, Caleb wandered the cabin in silence. He ate the soup Gideon made, but didn't speak unless spoken to. He watched the wolf from across the room, eyes flicking from the animal to his sketch pad, as if drawing gave him control over fear. That night, the silence between them grew heavier. Gideon sat in his chair reading, while Caleb huddled near the window, drawing by lantern light. Frost shifted, exhaling loudly. Caleb jumped. He always that loud. Gideon looked up. You'll get used to it. A pause. Why'd he let you help him? Didn't have a choice. Neither of us did. The next morning, something shifted. Caleb was on the floor a few feet from Frost's sketch pad in his lap. He wasn't drawing the wolf this time, he was reading aloud. His voice was uncertain, but he kept going, and the white fang of winter sank its teeth into the Yukon Valley. Gideon listened from the table, pretending not to watch. Frost didn't move, but he listened. Day by day, Caleb's fear softened. He began helping with Frost's care. At first, just pouring warm water into the bowl, then holding compresses. One morning, he asked Gideon how to massage the wolf's legs properly. Gideon taught him, showing how to apply pressure just above the haunches where the muscles remained stiff. You gotta feel the resistance, he said. Don't push past it. Let him tell you what he can take. Caleb nodded. His fingers trembled at first, but the wolf didn't flinch. Instead, Frost leaned into the boy's hands almost imperceptibly. That afternoon, the snow returned, soft, steady. Gideon suggested they build something together. A sled. Caleb's brow furrowed. For Frost. He's not going to stay inside forever. They spent 2 days on it. An old door frame, scrap wood leather straps, and copper tubing from an unused sink were transformed into a makeshift wooden sled with padded sides. Caleb painted Frost's name on it in dark green paint, then sketched tiny paw prints around the edges. The next morning, they lifted Frost onto the sled using a folded tarp. The wolf didn't resist. Outside, the snow was deep, but the trail behind the cabin was packed enough to manage. They pulled him along slowly. At first, Frost lay still, ears twitching. Then, as they reached the rise behind the clearing, he raised his head. His nose lifted to the wind. Caleb smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. He likes it, he said softly. Gideon nodded. He remembers the wild. Later that evening, after Frost was back near the fire and the sled had been dragged into the shed, Caleb brought out a sketch he'd made of the day. It showed the wolf, with his head tilted to the wind eyes closed in peace. Gideon stared at the image for a long time. You've got talent, kid. Caleb shrugged, trying to hide the flush in his cheeks. Mom says it's just a hobby. She ever see you draw something like this? No. Well, she should. The fire cracked. The room settled. Gideon stood and added a log, then turned back to Caleb. You know, he said, voice slow. When your mother was your age, she used to sit in that very spot and try to tame squirrels with breadcrumbs. Caleb blinked. Did it work? Not even close. The boy laughed genuinely, and for the first time the cabin didn't feel like it belonged to grief. That night, Gideon caught Caleb curled on the floor beside the wolf, both asleep, heads nearly touching. He didn't say a word. It had been 3 weeks since Caleb arrived, and the rhythms of the cabin had shifted into something close to harmony. Frost could now stand for brief moments, legs trembling, but upright, and he'd begun dragging himself short distances across the wooden floor before collapsing near the fire with a long exhale. Caleb had taken to waking early to feed him clean his paws and sketch whatever moment felt worth remembering. Gideon, meanwhile, found himself more talkative, more present, as if the boy's energy had cracked open something long frozen inside him. The snowfall had eased, and Jackson Hole's mornings brought a brittle brightness to the sky, blue and pale like a faded postcard. But peace, like the winter sun, was fragile. The knock came just after midday. Gideon was chopping firewood behind the shed when he heard it 2 deliberate raps on the cabin door. He wiped his hands on his jeans, glanced toward the tree line, and felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected company. At the door stood a tall man in a dark green ranger's jacket with a crisp silver badge pinned to his chest. His shoulders were squared, like someone who never forgot they wore a uniform. He was clean-shaven mid-40s and wore leather gloves even indoors. His voice was dry as kindling. "Gideon Wells, that's me. I'm Ranger Elias Rayburn, Teton Wildlife Division. Got a report from a local snowmobiler that you've been keeping a wild animal in your home. Wolf by description." Gideon didn't blink. "You get a lot of false reports out here." Rayburn stepped into the cabin without being invited, eyes sweeping the room like a surveyor. He didn't miss much. His gaze landed quickly on Frost, who was resting quietly near the fire tail, twitching slightly. "There's nothing false about that," Rayburn said flatly. Frost didn't move. Caleb, who'd been on the floor beside him, froze. His sketch pad slid across the floor and landed face up at Rayburn's boots, a drawing of the three of them, man, boy, wolf. Rayburn picked it up. "Nice art." Caleb said nothing. His hands curled into fists. Frost's injured Gideon said, stepping between the ranger and the fire. "Found him half dead in the river. He wouldn't have lasted an hour. That doesn't change the law." Rayburn's tone had no sharpness, but no warmth either. "Wolves are protected under federal and state regulation. Harboring one even injured is a violation. You're not a vet. Not wildlife licensed. He's not a threat. Doesn't matter. Protocol's protocol. If he's wild, he goes to the sanctuary or to the regional wildlife unit, or worse, if he's deemed compromised." Caleb stepped forward, voice shaking. "You can't take him. He's healing. He's not like the others." Rayburn looked at him not unkindly. "Son, it's not about what we want. It's about what's right for the animal and the people. He's not dangerous," Caleb insisted. Rayburn turned back to Gideon. "You've got until tomorrow morning. Either I come back and find this wolf gone, or I come back with 2 more men and a tranquilizer gun. Your choice." He left without shaking hands. The cabin remained silent for several minutes after the door shut. Outside, the wind kicked up again, swirling loose snow into the window panes. Caleb sat down hard near the stove. "They'll take him. They'll put him in a cage." Maybe Gideon said, his voice tired. Maybe not. "But he won't be with us. But we saved him. That doesn't mean we own him." Caleb turned to Frost, eyes pleading. "We can't just let them take you." Frost didn't make a sound, but his gaze, calm understanding, held them both. That night, the fire burned low. Caleb refused to go upstairs instead, wrapping himself in a blanket next to Frost on the rug. Gideon wrote quietly in his journal for a long time, pausing only to look at the 2 of them. He didn't sleep. By dawn, he had a decision. "Get dressed," he told Caleb, pouring hot tea into a thermos. "We're going for a walk." They wrapped Frost gently in thick wool, used the sled they'd built together, and packed provisions. The boy said nothing, eyes red from the night. Frost lay still, head up, right ears twitching, as if he sensed what lay ahead. They headed northwest toward the edges of Upper Cascade Canyon, the vast basin tucked behind jagged ridges and snow-choked evergreens. It was a long haul, the sled sliding unevenly over crusted snow. But they took turns pulling, stopping only when Frost stirred or when the terrain grew steep. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, more like reverence. Near a frozen ravine, Gideon slowed and raised a hand. "This is the place." It was a clearing shaped like a cradle ringed with pines, so tall they sliced the sky. Somewhere beyond it, the wilderness opened uncharted valleys, untrapped snowfields, and the echoes of wolves. Frost raised his head and listened. Then from the distant ridgelines came the sound, thin at first, then fuller. The long rising howl of a wild pack. It rolled through the trees like wind through a canyon. Frost turned. He looked at Caleb first, then Gideon. There was no fear in his eyes. He stepped off the sled on his own. Slowly, carefully, he walked across the snow. His steps were unsteady but determined. Halfway through the clearing, he stopped, looked back once, then trotted forward until his white coat vanished between the trees. Caleb fell to his knees. Gideon placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. They didn't speak. The wind carried another howl, this one, stronger, deeper, layered with something unmistakable belonging. The snow fell again that night, not in a storm, but gently, like feathers brushing the earth. The wind had softened. The silence that followed Frost's departure was the kind that settled not only in the woods, but in the bones. Gideon and Caleb stood in the clearing long after the white blur of the wolf disappeared into the pines, unable to move. The only sound was their breath, steady and slow, mingling with the cold air. Caleb knelt, gathering the sled's leather strap in his hands, but didn't pull. Instead, he reached into his coat and took out his sketchbook. He opened to the last page, a half-drawn portrait of Frost, unfinished, the eyes only sketched in. He stared at it for a long time. Gideon crouched beside him. "You want to finish it?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "No, I think he finishes it himself now." The walk back was silent. The trail they'd made seemed to have vanished behind them, covered by falling snow. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully taken the sky. The following days passed slowly. Frost's absence was loud in its own way. The cabin, though still warm with fire and breath and stories, felt like a book missing its final chapter. Caleb, still quiet, drew more than he spoke. But something had changed in him. His posture was straighter, his gaze more assured. One morning, Gideon found the boy outside sitting on a rock near the tree line, with his sketch pad open and the old camera beside him. "Thought you weren't a photographer?" Caleb said when Gideon stepped closer. "I wasn't," Gideon replied, "but maybe I stopped too soon." They took photos together that day, Caleb drawing, while Gideon learned to frame a mountain again, to wait for the way light touches snow just before it melts. Spring came slowly to Jackson Hole. The ice on the Snake River cracked, then split. The wind changed, bringing with it the earthy scent of thawed ground and sap. With it came news from Boston. Caleb's mother, Elena Monroe, a sharp-featured woman with tired eyes, and a voice that once commanded courtrooms, had called to ask when her son would be returning. "She misses you," Gideon said one evening, as they watched elk cross the ridge through binoculars. Caleb didn't respond at first. Then he said, "She doesn't really know me, not since Dad left." Gideon placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She's trying. That counts for something." Eventually, Caleb agreed to go back, but only for the summer. He left with a suitcase full of sketches, a camera, and a promise to return when the leaves turned gold again. Years passed. Gideon remained in the cabin, though it was no longer a retreat from the world, but a part of it. He sent letters to Caleb, who eventually moved back to Jackson Hole, not as a child in need of saving, but as a man who had learned what wildness meant. Caleb became a wildlife artist. His work, displayed in local galleries and national exhibits, always carried one recurring motif: a white wolf, sometimes alone in the trees, sometimes hidden behind mist, always watching. He visited the cabin often, especially on clear nights. He and Gideon would sit on the porch with mugs of hot coffee, watching the stars blink into view. And every now and then, when the wind was right, they'd hear it. A howl, not mournful, not lost, just strong and sure and full. "It's him," Caleb would say. Gideon would nod. Always was. One such night years later, Caleb brought someone with him. Mira, a quiet-eyed woman with wind-tangled hair and a firm handshake. She was an ecologist who had met Caleb during a gallery interview. She listened more than she spoke and carried field notes in her back pocket. "She believes wolves remember voices," Caleb said that evening by the fire. "Not just scent or sight voice." Gideon smiled. "Then he'll never forget yours." The old sled remained hanging in the shed, now painted over with Caleb's adult hands, detailed paw prints, the outline of the Tetons, and a new image, a boy and a wolf standing side by side. In early winter of his final year, Gideon fell ill. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slower in breath, softer in tone. He told Caleb he was ready not with sorrow but with peace. His last request was simple: "When I go, don't bury me near town. Take me to the clearing. The one where he left us, Caleb did. He carried his grandfather's ashes in a cedar box, walking the trail they'd once pulled Frost across. The snow was light that day. The pines stood silent witness. He placed the box beneath a pine that leaned slightly east, marked with an old clawed groove in the bark Frost's mark. That night, as Caleb and Mira sat by the old cabin's fire, they heard it again. The howl. It was closer this time. Not a memory, not a ghost. Just Frost still out there, still calling. Still home. Sometimes the ones we save end up saving us. Frost reminded Gideon and Caleb that healing doesn't always roar. It can arrive on 4 legs in silence, asking only for time and trust. In our daily lives, we often overlook the quiet ones, the wounded ones, the ones who don't speak but feel deeply. But maybe all they need is someone to stay, to listen, to believe. And maybe like Frost, they'll return the kindness in ways we never expect. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a little hope. Leave a comment to tell us what part stayed with you. And if you believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories waiting, just like Frost, just like us.